The 25th of December, 1944. 11:43 in the morning. High in the frozen, crystalline skies above Liege, Belgium, 25-year-old squadron leader Alistair Miller banked his Griffon-engined Supermarine Spitfire Mk14, the thoroughbred warplane thrumming with immense power beneath him. At 20,000 feet, the air was thin and mercilessly cold, a vast, empty cathedral of blue. But as he scanned the world below, he saw something that sent a jolt of pure, primal adrenaline through his heart, a feeling as familiar to him as the biting winds of his Highland home. Far beneath him, at perhaps 10,000 feet, a great swarm of hornets was moving against the pristine white canvas of the snow-dusted Ardennes. 50, perhaps more, Focke-Wulf 190s, the butcher birds of the Luftwaffe, were descending upon the beleaguered British and American ground positions like a steel plague. 50 enemy fighters against his own section of 12 Spitfires. Any Royal Air Force training manual, any tactical doctrine drilled into him from his first days as a flight cadet, would dictate a single, unequivocal course of action. Wait for reinforcements. Maintain the precious advantage of height. Coordinate a structured, disciplined attack. But Alistair Miller, a man whose instincts were honed not in lecture halls but on the unforgiving granite slopes of the Cairngorms, did not fight by the book. Instead, he did something his instructors would have condemned in the strongest possible terms, something they would have labeled, without a moment's hesitation, as sheer suicide. He rolled his Spitfire, its elegant elliptical wings catching the winter sun, and plunged into a near-vertical dive, straight down into the churning heart of the enemy formation. Alone. Without cover. Without any discernible plan. What the German pilots, veterans of 100 dogfights, did not and could not know, was that they were about to encounter the single most lethal aerial combat technique on the Western Front. A technique that owed nothing to the revered teachings of Air Marshal Dowding or the strategists at Bentley Priory. It came from a place far older, far wilder. It came from the ancient art of stalking red stag on the mist-shrouded moors of Scotland. To truly comprehend how a quiet lad from Inverness developed an air combat philosophy that defied all established doctrine, we must travel back in time, to the brisk Highland summer of 1940. Alistair Miller is 21 years old. The Battle of Britain is raging in the skies to the south, but here, in the vast, empty expanse of his uncle's estate in the Scottish Highlands, the war feels a world away. His primary duty is not to his country, but to the herd. His task is to protect the estate's deer from poachers and, more importantly, to cull the herd by stalking the magnificent red stags. Now, the red stags of the Highlands are not like other deer. They are spectral creatures, monarchs of the glen, possessed of an almost supernatural cunning and senses honed to a razor's edge by millennia of survival. They are larger, wiser, and infinitely more challenging to hunt than any deer elsewhere in the British Isles. The traditional methods, passed down through generations of gillies, are exercises in monumental patience. A hunter must become one with the landscape, spending days, sometimes weeks, crawling on his belly through soaking heather and freezing peat, his movements measured in inches, his scent masked by mud and rain, always mindful of the shifting wind that could carry the slightest human trace for miles, spooking the entire glen. Traps are utterly useless, for the stags can sense the cold taint of iron from 1,000 yards. Even long-range rifles require a stillness and patience that the rugged, windswept terrain rarely affords. Young Alistair, however, developed his own method, born of a frustration with tradition and an intuitive understanding of animal instinct. The stags expect a hunter to act like a hunter, he explained one evening to his grizzled uncle, Hamish, a man whose face was a roadmap of Highland weather. They expect you to be silent, to wait, to be patient. They're wired to detect stealth. So, I do the precise opposite. His technique was breathtakingly simple, yet utterly counterintuitive. Instead of stalking his quarry for days on end, he would first locate a stag from a great distance. Then, rather than beginning a painstaking, methodical approach, he would wait for the moment the stag was partially obscured by a dip in the terrain or a rocky outcrop. And then, he would run. He would sprint directly towards the animal's last known position, at full, reckless speed, his boots pounding against the unforgiving ground. No hiding. No subtlety. Just a sudden, explosive burst of aggressive, unnatural movement. The stags, their brains conditioned over centuries to flee from slow, calculated, predatory threats, would be momentarily paralyzed. When this human shape, this unexpected, noisy danger, suddenly burst over a ridge just yards away, their ancient instincts would short-circuit. That moment of profound confusion, those 2 or 3 seconds of indecision as the animal's mind struggled to categorize the threat, was all the time Alistair needed. A single, well-placed shot from his .303 Lee Enfield, and the hunt was over. "It's daft, lad," his uncle would mutter, shaking his head in disbelief. "No stalker worth his salt would ever do such a thing. It's sacrilege." But Alistair's results were undeniable. He brought down more stags than any other man on the estate. 3 times more, according to the meticulous ledgers his uncle kept in a smoke-stained notebook. 4 years later, that same daft technique was about to make Alistair Miller the RAF's deadliest Spitfire ace in the European theatre of operations. January 1944. The damp, sprawling RAF aerodrome at Bodney, in the flatlands of Norfolk. Squadron leader Alistair Miller has just been assigned to a squadron in the 2nd Tactical Air Force. He is 24 years old, with no confirmed aerial victories to his name and a reputation as a competent, if somewhat unremarkable, pilot. His training assessments described him as proficient, but lacking distinction. His maneuvers were often unorthodox, his adherence to strict formation discipline, questionable. But something fundamental shifted on his very first real combat mission. His squadron was escorting a box of Lancaster bombers on a daylight raid over Germany when a formation of Messerschmitt Bf 109s appeared, climbing out of the sun. The squadron leader's voice crackled over the radio, ordering a standard tactical approach: gain altitude, position themselves with the sun at their backs, and engage in a coordinated, copybook attack. Alistair either did not hear the order, or he chose, in that critical moment, to ignore it. Instead, he did precisely what he had done with the stags in the Highlands. He nosed his Spitfire over, pushed the throttle through the gate, and accelerated directly towards the unsuspecting Germans. No evasive jinx, no tactical positioning, just a headlong charge into the enemy. The lead German pilot, an Oberleutnant and a veteran of over 100 missions, a man who had survived the Battle of Britain and the savage fighting over the Eastern Front, did exactly what the Highland stags had done. He froze. For a second, perhaps 2, his highly trained mind simply could not process the raw data his eyes were feeding it. A single enemy fighter, breaking formation and flying directly at him, making no attempt to gain an advantage, following no recognizable pattern of attack. It was illogical. It was insane. And in those 2 seconds of cognitive dissonance, Alistair opened fire. His Spitfire's 220mm cannons and 4.303 Browning machine guns erupted in a furious torrent of destruction. The Messerschmitt disintegrated in a blossom of fire and black smoke before its seasoned pilot could even begin to react. It was Miller's first confirmed victory. But it was what happened after that transformed a simple kill into a revolutionary combat philosophy. When he returned to the aerodrome, his superiors were incandescent with rage. "That was a suicidal stunt," Miller, his group captain, bellowed, his face puce with fury during the debriefing. "You abandoned your position, you broke formation, and you flew straight at the bloody Jerry without any cover whatsoever. You're lucky to be alive, and you're even luckier I don't have you court-martialed." Alistair tried to explain his logic, the reasoning behind the madness. He spoke of the enemy's confusion, the element of pure shock, the profound advantage of the utterly unexpected. "That is the most idiotic thing I have ever heard," the group captain retorted, cutting him off. "The Luftwaffe are professional fighting men, squadron leader, not wild animals," but Alistair knew something that the group captain, for all his experience and rank, could not possibly understand. Fighter pilots, especially the most experienced veterans, develop instincts. They build patterns of expectation. They are trained to anticipate standard maneuvers and to respond with standard, well-rehearsed countermeasures. When an opponent does something so completely outside the realm of accepted tactics, those finely honed instincts fail them. The brain requires time to process the new, anomalous information, to formulate a fresh response. And in the brutal calculus of aerial combat, where decisions are measured in fractions of a second, that processing time is a death sentence. The stags are the most intelligent predators in the Highlands, Alastair later explained quietly to a fellow pilot, a man who, unlike his superiors, was willing to listen. And my technique worked on them every single time. Jerry pilots are good, very good. But they're no smarter than an old stag from the Cairngorms. Over the ensuing months, Alastair meticulously refined his technique. He discovered that sheer speed was the critical component. The faster his approach, the greater the enemy's confusion and the shorter their reaction time. He began to use gravity as his greatest ally, almost always initiating his attacks from a higher altitude, converting height into blinding velocity. He also worked out the optimal angle of attack, not directly head-on, but at a shallow angle of roughly 20 degrees off the enemy's axis. It was enough to appear as a frontal assault, creating maximum shock, but the slight offset presented a larger target profile of the enemy aircraft to his guns. And most crucially, he learned when not to use the technique. The Stork only works against pilots who expect you to act like a pilot, he would explain. Against the greenhorns, the novices who don't know what to expect anyway, it loses its edge. With them, I use conventional tactics. What makes this story so extraordinary are not merely the numbers, though the numbers themselves are staggering. By June of 1944, Alastair Mac Miller had 19 confirmed victories. By August, 26. By October, 31. The extraordinary part is how he achieved them. A painstaking analysis of his combat reports reveals a consistent, almost unbelievable pattern. 84% of his victories occurred within the first 15 seconds of an engagement. The average Luftwaffe pilot he faced was shot down before he could complete his first defensive break. 91% of his attacks were frontal or near frontal, an approach that conventional doctrine considered tantamount to suicide. Only 3 of his eventual 37 victories came in prolonged dogfights lasting more than 2 minutes. His method was not traditional aerial combat, it was a high-speed ambush disguised as a madman's charge. On the 6th of August, 1944, squadron leader Alastair Miller wrote the most legendary page of his career. His squadron was tasked with providing top cover for a vast formation of American B-17 flying fortresses over Berlin when they were intercepted by a massive force of German fighters. At least 30 Focke-Wulf 190s and 20 Messerschmitt 109s rose to meet them. 50 bandits against 16 RAF Spitfires. The wing commander's voice came over the radio, terse and strained, ordering a defensive screen. Maintain position. Protect the bombers at all costs. Alastair requested permission to engage. The request was denied. He did it anyway. He rolled his Spitfire over and plunged towards the immense German formation. The other pilots in his squadron, men who had now witnessed his impossible technique succeed dozens of times, hesitated for only a heartbeat before following their unorthodox leader into the fray. What transpired in the next 7 minutes became the stuff of legend, a tale told in hushed, reverent tones in Nissen huts and mess halls across England. Alastair shot down his first Jerry 40 seconds into the attack. His second fell at 78 seconds. A third Messerschmitt tumbled out of the sky in flames at 2 minutes and 14 seconds. By the time the bewildered German formation managed to reorganize and mount a coherent defense, Alastair had personally shot down 6 enemy aircraft. 6 victories in a single sortie, a record no RAF pilot in the European theatre had ever achieved. But again, the sheer number does not tell the full story. What made that day so remarkable was the how. 4 of his 6 kills were initiated with a direct, head-on charge. 4 veteran German pilots, men with hundreds of combat hours, were left paralyzed by a tactic their minds could not compute. The 5th was shot down as he tried to come to the aid of a wingman Alastair had just crippled. The 6th was picked off as he attempted to disengage and flee the carnage. After that mission, Alastair's superiors finally stopped questioning his methods. The group captain who had once threatened to court-martial him wrote in his official report, Squadron Leader Miller has developed an approach to air-to-air combat which, whilst violating established tactical principles, produces consistently superior results. It is recommended that his methods be studied for possible incorporation into pilot training. But therein lay the problem. Alistair's technique worked precisely because it was unexpected. It was a singular, brilliant anomaly. If every RAF pilot began employing the Highland stalk, the Germans would quickly adapt. The element of shock would be lost, and the advantage would evaporate. And so, the technique was never formalized, never officially taught. It remained the personal, deadly secret of a quiet Highlander who saw the aces of the Luftwaffe as little more than winged stags. By December of 1944, Squadron Leader Miller had 37 confirmed victories. He was the most lethal British ace of the European War, having surpassed the tallies of any other Spitfire pilot, any Typhoon pilot, any Allied pilot flying in the theatre. And he had achieved this with a technique his own instructors had dismissed as idiotic, a technique that flew in the face of every principle of aerial combat they had ever taught him. A technique learned not in a cockpit, but in the vast, wild emptiness of the Scottish Highlands. The great irony is that Alistair Miller never sought to be a hero, he never craved glory. In his letters home to his family in Inverness, he seldom mentioned his victories. "I'm just doing my job, Mother," he wrote in October 1944. "The same way I did my job on Uncle Hamish's estate. The Jerrys are good, but they're no more difficult than a cunning old stag." On the 25th of December, 1944, the day that opened our story, Squadron Leader Alistair Miller was flying his 143rd mission. At 11:43 in the morning, when he saw those 50 Focke-Wulfs savaging the Allied positions near Liege, he did exactly what he always did. He dived. Alone. At maximum speed. Straight into the teeth of the enemy. In the first 90 seconds, he shot down 2 German fighters, 2 more veteran pilots who failed to process what was happening before cannon shells tore their aircraft, and their lives, apart. But then, something happened that Alistair's unique instincts could not have anticipated. The Royal Artillery anti-aircraft batteries on the ground, seeing a single fighter diving vertically, pursued by a swarm of German aircraft, made a fatal assumption. They identified the lone pursuer as a German, harried by his comrades. They opened fire. At 11:47, just 4 minutes after initiating his final, devastating attack, Alistair Miller's Spitfire was struck by a shell from a friendly gun. He was killed instantly, at the age of 25. 143 missions. 37 confirmed victories. Brought down not by the Luftwaffe he had so consistently outwitted, but by his own countrymen who could not identify him in time. The tragedy of his death momentarily obscured his legacy, but the fundamental truth that Alistair Miller demonstrated remains as valid today as it was 80 years ago. Sometimes, the most effective tactic is the one nobody expects. Sometimes, conventional wisdom is merely that, conventional. And sometimes, a quiet boy from the Scottish Highlands, armed with a daft technique, can defeat the most highly trained pilots in the world. Because the aces of the Luftwaffe expected to fight RAF pilots. They had trained for it. They had countermeasures for it. What they had not trained for, what they could never have prepared for, was fighting a deerstalker from the Cairngorms. After his death, the Air Ministry did, in fact, study his technique in meticulous detail. The analysts were astounded by the data. They discovered that Alistair had been right. Pilots, even seasoned veterans, experience a measurable processing lag when confronted with utterly unexpected tactics. That lag, measured in milliseconds, can be the difference between life and death in the cockpit. But they also discovered why the technique could never be universally taught. It required a very specific, and very rare, type of pilot. It demanded an individual capable of completely suppressing the instinct for self-preservation. Someone who could fly directly into the guns of the enemy without hesitation, without calculating the odds, without a single thought for the overwhelming risk. Squadron Leader Miller did not fly towards the enemy in spite of his fear, one analyst wrote in his final report. It seems he flew towards the enemy because he did not experience fear in the same way as other pilots. His physiological stress response was unique, almost preternatural. Perhaps it was because he had spent his formative years running headlong at giant, antlered beasts in the wilds of Scotland. Perhaps it was simply how his brain was wired. Whatever the reason, it worked. 37 times, it worked. 37 German pilots who discovered, all too late, that they were facing something they could not comprehend. A Highland hunter who applied the logic of the misty glen